You don't look like someone the new year would leave out in the cold. And yet here you are, forgotten on its very eve. Snow hissed against the platform as the train doors groaned open at Drabenfels. Ottilie Hagen stepped down into a night sharp enough to cut. The engine exhaled one last cloud of steam that vanished almost instantly, leaving only iron-cold air and the bite of alpine wind. Her boots sank into the thin, gritty layer of snow that had already refrozen on the stones. One gloved hand gripped the handle of a worn brown leather suitcase. The other held a crumpled telegram that weighed more than the bag ever could. 12 words, no punctuation, no kindness. Arrangement dissolved. Circumstances altered. Regret any inconvenience. Albrecht von Hohenlohe. Around her, the little mountain station pulsed with warmth that had nothing to do with her. Families spilled from the carriages, cheeks red, voices bright, embracing, laughing, gathering children in parcels. Lanterns swung. Church bells began their distant rehearsal for midnight. Somewhere down the slope, the first faint fireworks cracked against the peaks like breaking ice. The air smelled of pine smoke, hot chestnuts, spiced punch, someone else's new beginning. Ottilie stood perfectly still in the tide of reunion, invisible. She tried to decide whether to beg, to scream, or simply to walk into the dark until the cold finished what the telegram had started. She had come for a marriage she had never met, a practical arrangement, a door out of Munich's debts and whispers and hands that took what was not offered. She had not expected tenderness, she had expected shelter. Now even that was ash. 4 coins rattled in her purse, not enough for a ticket home, not enough for a room, and home was no longer a place she could return to. The platform emptied, sleigh bells faded down the lane. The station master gave her a small, helpless nod, shuttered his window, and turned the key. The click echoed like a door closing on her life. Ottilie lifted the suitcase, her knuckles whitened around the handle. Hunger sharpened into something almost welcome, cleaner than shame. She followed the golden glow of the village until she reached the Golden Hirsch Gasthaus. Through frost-laced windows, she saw warmth she could not afford, lamplight, laughter, steaming plates. At a table near the glass sat one solitary man, broad-shouldered, dark-bearded, hazel eyes steady beneath the brim of his brown felt hat, eating slowly, deliberately, as though the simple meal mattered. Their gazes met across the frost. Before she could turn away, the door opened. "Hungry?" he asked, voice low, no pity in it, only truth. That single word, spoken on a freezing New Year's Eve, would change everything. The door of the Golden Hirsch Gasthaus swung open with a gust of cold that made the lanterns flicker. Ottilie stood frozen on the threshold, snowflakes melting on her lashes, her breath clouding in the sudden warmth. The man at the window table rose slowly. Up close, he was taller than she'd guessed, broad through the shoulders, his dark beard neatly trimmed, hazel eyes calm and unreadable beneath the brim of his felt hat. He wore a simple wool coat, no finery to mark him as anything more than another traveler seeking shelter from the night. "Come in," he said quietly, in German softened by the local mountain cadence, "before the cold claims you." Ottilie hesitated, shame burning hotter than hunger. She was no beggar, not yet, but her stomach twisted sharply enough to answer for her. She stepped inside. The room was half empty, most villagers already home with their families for Sylvester. A fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of roasted goose and spiced punch drifted from the kitchen. The Baron, if that was truly who he was, gestured to the bench opposite his own. "Sit." She did, clutching her suitcase on her lap like armor. He pushed his plate across the scarred wooden table, thick slices of smoked sausage, dark bread still warm from the oven, a small crock of sharp mustard. Steam rose gently between them. "Eat," he said, not a command, simply a fact. Ottilie's fingers trembled as she took the fork. The first bite nearly undid her. Salt and smoke and honest hunger had met at last. She ate carefully, aware of his gaze, but he asked no questions and offered no pity. He only signaled the innkeeper for a second mug of hot Sylvester punch, cinnamon and clove, orange peel floating like tiny suns, and placed it before her without ceremony. When the plate was clean and the mug empty, he laid a few coins on the table, enough for both meals and more. The innkeeper nodded, unsurprised. Outside, the church bells began to toll midnight. Fireworks bloomed sudden and bright over the black peaks, painting the snow gold and crimson. The man stood and buttoned his coat. "The streets are no place for you tonight. Come." Ottilie followed because there was nowhere else to go. Snow muffled their footsteps as they walked the lantern-lit lane. He carried her suitcase without asking. The village slept behind shuttered windows, but light spilled from one small house at the edge of the square, a neat two-story boarding house with window boxes empty now, but waiting for spring. He knocked once. The door opened to reveal a sturdy woman in her 50s, gray-streaked hair braided for bed, eyes sharp but kind. "Emile," she greeted him warmly, "bringing strays again?" "This one needs a roof, Frida," he answered, "and honest work to pay for it." Frida Keller studied Ottilie in the lamplight, took in the worn cloak, the pale exhaustion, the stubborn lift of the chin, and nodded. "There's a small room under the eaves. You'll help with chores and cooking. We'll settle terms tomorrow." She stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze solid, child." Ottilie crossed the threshold into warmth that smelled of pine and fresh bread. For the first time in days, perhaps years, kindness arrived without a price attached. No debt she could see, no expectation in those steady hazel eyes. The Baron handed her the suitcase. "Good night, Fraulein." "Hagen," she managed. "Ottilie Hagen." He touched the brim of his hat. "Emile von Draben." Then he was gone, swallowed by swirling snow and distant fireworks. Frida bustled her upstairs to a narrow room with a slanted ceiling, a real bed, and a quilt thick enough to keep out alpine winters. Ottilie sank onto the mattress fully dressed, too weary even to remove her boots. Midnight had come and gone. The new year had begun. She was asleep almost before the last rocket faded. Hours later, though it felt like only moments, a soft scrape at the front door below woke her. Footsteps on the stairs, a pause outside her room, then the quiet rustle of paper sliding beneath the boarding house door downstairs. Ottilie sat up, heart suddenly loud in the silence. She crept down the dark stairs and stocking feet. A single sealed envelope lay on the mat, addressed in elegant script, "To the intended bride of Albrecht von Hohenlohe-Drabenfels." The wax seal was unbroken. No footprint marred the fresh snow outside the door. Whoever had delivered it was already gone. Ottilie carried the letter upstairs by candlelight, hands trembling again, but this time not from cold. What truth waited inside those careful folds? Morning light filtered through the small attic window, soft and gray, carrying the scent of fresh bread upward on warm air. Ottilie woke slowly, half expecting the narrow bed and thick quilt to dissolve into the hard seat of a third-class carriage. But the boarding house held steady around her, timbers creaking gently in the cold, the faint clatter of pots below. Frida Keller moved with brisk efficiency, sleeves rolled high, stirring a pot of barley soup that filled the room with comforting steam. "You're up," Frida said without turning. "Good. There's coffee on the stove and bread on the board. Eat, then we'll find chores to fit your hands." A girl of about 12 darted in from the pantry, bright-eyed, freckled, braids flying. "Mama, the hens need feeding." She stopped short at the sight of Ottilie, curiosity winning over shyness. "I'm Annalise. Are you staying?" "For now," Ottilie answered softly. The child's open smile loosened something tight in her chest. After breakfast, Frida handed her the sealed letter from the night before. "This came for you. Best read alone if it's private." Ottilie took it upstairs, heart thudding. She broke the wax with careful fingers. The paper was heavy, the handwriting precise and feminine. Albrecht von Hohenlohe had died of a sudden fever 3 days before her scheduled arrival. His sister wrote with regret for the curt telegram, sent in haste and grief, and enclosed a small bank draft to cover return travel. There was no blame, only sorrow that circumstances had robbed them both of the arranged future. Ottilie sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the words until they blurred. She had never met the man, never even seen a likeness, yet she had carried his name across half of Bavaria like a talisman against despair. Now he was gone, and what she mourned most sharply was not a person, but the promise of safety she had pinned to him, a future, not a man. She folded the letter away. The bank draft she would return. Pride demanded it, and something quieter insisted she was done running backward. Downstairs, the day unfolded in small, steady tasks, scrubbing potatoes, beating rugs in the crisp air, hanging laundry that froze stiff on the line. Annalise chattered beside her, teaching the names of mountain peaks visible beyond the rooftops. Frida watched with approval, but asked no questions. Late afternoon, Baron Emil von Draben came to the door, arms loaded with split pine. He stacked it neatly by the stove without ceremony. "Thought you might need more than what's here," he said. His hazel eyes met Ottilie's briefly, steady, unreadable, then moved on to Frida. "The pass is drifting shut. More snow tonight." "Thank you, Emil," Frida replied. "Stay for coffee?" He shook his head. "Another time." A nod to Ottilie, almost shy, and he was gone. That evening, after supper, Frida brought out the traditional Silvester lead. A spoonful of metal melted over the flame, then poured hissing into cold water. The shapes hardened quickly. A ship for Annalise, travel ahead. A heart for Frida, love enduring. A crown for Ottilie. "New beginnings you'll shape yourself," Frida murmured, turning the tiny lead crown in her palm. "Not ones handed to you." Ottilie traced its edges, warmth spreading slow and cautious through her ribs. Perhaps the year could be molded, not merely endured. Later, as she helped clear the table, Annalise tugged her sleeve. "Mama heard from the baker. The station master told him a stranger in city clothes was asking questions this morning about a woman named Hagen who arrived last night." Ottilie's hands stilled on the plate. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, thick and silent. Who was watching her and why? A week slipped by in the gentle cadence of the boarding house. Mornings kneading bread beside Frida, afternoons mending linens while Annalise recited school lessons aloud, evenings watching snow pile softly against the window panes. Ottilie's hands grew steadier, her sleep deeper. The village nodded to her now in passing, cautious but not unkind. Emil came twice more, once with a sack of apples from his orchard, once to mend a loose shutter, his presence quiet as falling flakes. Then, on a bright midwinter morning, when the market filled the village square with stalls of cheese and wool, a sleek black sleigh glided to a stop before the church. Out stepped a man in fine Munich tailoring, tall, lean, with sharp features and hair slicked back like a city raven. Victor von Hohenlohe carried himself as though the mountains should bow. He found Ottilie at the baker's stall, selecting loaves with Anneliese. His smile was polished, but his eyes calculated. "Fräulein Hagen, I presume." His voice carried the clipped accent of drawing rooms. "A word, if you please." Anneliese edged closer to Ottilie. Villagers slowed, sensing drama in the air. Victor drew her aside beneath the linden tree, bare branches glittering with frost. From his coat he produced a leather folder thick with papers and a purse that clinked heavily. "My uncle's estate is mine by right," he said softly for her ears alone. "Sign this waiver of any claim, real or imagined, and this money is yours, enough to begin anew anywhere but here. Refuse, and certain unpleasant details from your Munich days might find their way into conversation. Debts unpaid, family scandals best left buried." Ottilie's breath clouded between them. The old fear stirred, whispers of her father's ruin, creditors at the door, the desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a bride. But something new steadied her spine. "I have no claim to press," she answered, voice low but clear, "and no price for my silence about things already known to God." Victor's smile thinned. "Fräulein, think carefully. Mud clings." At that moment Emile appeared, as though summoned by the tension in the air. He had been across the square bartering for nails. Now he stood at Ottilie's shoulder, broad and immovable. "The lady has spoken," he said calmly. No raised voice, no threat, only the quiet weight of a man accustomed to being heard. "Drobenfels has its own way of judging strangers who bring trouble." Victor's gaze flicked between them, assessing. Then he inclined his head, a predator retreating, for now. "We shall see." He returned to his sleigh and was gone in a swirl of snow. The square resumed its bustle, but glances lingered. That night in the Golden Hirsch guest house, voices murmured over steins of beer. A traveler from the lowlands spoke of a Munich girl with a shadowed past, seeking fortune among honest folk. Another wondered aloud if certain barons were too quick to shelter strays. Ottilie heard none of it directly. Frida kept her home with a warm brick at her feet and a cup of linden tea. But the chill of it reached her all the same. How long before buried secrets rose with the morning snow? The whispers began as softly as snow settling on rooftops, but they grew heavier with each passing day. Victor von Honelo had not left empty-handed. Before the parting, he'd passed a faded newspaper clipping to the postmaster, yellowed edges, bold headlines screaming of a Munich merchant's ruin years ago, debts unpaid, a family scandal best left buried. Ottilie's family. Her name was not printed, but the details fit like a key in an old lock. By week's end, the village air had cooled toward her. The baker's wife served her bread with downcast eyes. Women at the well spoke in murmurs that hushed when she approached. Even Anneliese came home from school with questions in her frown. "Mama says some people talk, but I told them you make the best apple strudel." Ottilie bore it quietly, chin high, hands busy. Frida watched her closely but said little, only pressed a trowel into her palm one mild afternoon when the sun drew faint steam from the thawing ground. "The herb garden's been neglected since my husband passed," Frida said. "If you've a mind to tend it, the soil's yours." Ottilie knelt in the cold earth behind the boarding house, turning the dark loam with careful fingers. She planted the few saved seeds, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage. The work steadied her breath, rooted her thoughts. Roots, she learned, push deepest through stony ground. They do not ask permission from the frost above. One dusk, as she brushed soil from her skirt, Emile appeared at the gate with a small clay pot in his gloved hands. Inside grew a sturdy rosemary cutting, its needles sharp and fragrant. "From my mother's plant," he said simply. "It winters well." His hazel eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary, something gentle flickering there before he turned away. The gesture lingered like the herb's scent on her skin. Then came a crisp winter morning when the sky hung clear and blue, the kind that made the mountains gleam like cut glass. Ottilie rose early, penned a careful account on plain paper, her father's honest failure in business, the creditors who took everything, her own flight from shame, not guilt. No excuses, no pleas, only truth. She walked to the church door while the village still slept, hammer and nail borrowed from Frida's shed. The paper went up squarely beneath a notice board, weighted against the wind. Let them read, let them judge, or understand. By midday, a small knot of villagers gathered, voices low. Some nodded slowly, others walked on. But the air shifted, less chill, more curious. Victor returned that very afternoon, sleigh bells announcing him like a warning. He found her in the garden, hands earth-stained, and offered a purse heavier than the first. "Final chance," he said, smile sharp. "Take this and go quietly, or I ensure every door in Drabenfels closes to you forever, the Baron's included." Ottilie met his gaze, rosemary needles pricking her palm like quiet courage. Will she take the money and run? The blizzard came down from the peaks without warning, a roaring wall of white that swallowed the village in mid-afternoon. Annalise had slipped out after lunch to deliver mended gloves to the cooper's wife, just a short errand down the lane she'd promised, but the wind rose fierce and sudden, erasing paths and rooftops alike. When the child did not return, Frida's face drained of color. Ottilie was already pulling on her cloak. "I'll find her." Emil arrived moments later, snow cresting his beard, drawn by the same instinct, or perhaps by Frida's frantic call into the storm. Without a word, he handed Ottilie a lantern and took her arm. They stepped into the whiteout together. Visibility fell to mere feet. Wind clawed at their coats, driving ice into every seam. They called Annalise's name until their voices cracked, following the faint line of fence posts toward the Cooper's lane. Emil's broad frame shielded Ottilie from the worst gusts. Her hand stayed tucked in his elbow, steady as an anchor. They found her at last, huddled in the lee of a haystack, half buried, cheeks blue but eyes fierce with relief. Emil lifted her easily, wrapping her inside his coat. Ottilie guided them home by memory and will, lantern flame guttering but never dying. Back at the boarding house, Frida wept quietly over her daughter, bundling her in blankets with hot bricks and broth. The storm howled on, sealing them all inside. Later, when Annalise slept and Frida dozed in her chair, Ottilie and Emil sat by the hearth. The fire's glow painted gold across his tired features. Silence stretched, companionable yet charged. He spoke first, voice low. "I lost my wife and son to fever 8 winters ago, a boy not yet 3. The words came out measured, as though long carried alone. Some days the quiet is heavier than others. Ottilie's heart ached for the grief he'd worn so silently, the kindness born not of ease, but of knowing loss too well. She reached to add wood to the flames. Their hands brushed, lingered. Warmth flared between them, undeniable as embers leaping to life. Neither pulled away. Days later the storm broke. Sunlight glittered on fresh drifts, and the first green hints dared the southern ridges. A post rider fought through with a thick envelope from Munich, documents long sought, affidavits from old neighbors attesting that her father's debts had been settled honorably after his death, the supposed scandal nothing but malicious rumor. Proof enough to silence Victor forever. Ottilie turned the pages in the quiet kitchen, pulse quick. Truth lay in her hands now, sharp as any blade. But would she dare wield it? Spring arrived in earnest, melting the last deep drifts into rushing streams that sang down the mountainsides. Crocuses pushed through the herb garden Ottilie had coaxed to life, and the air carried the clean promise of thaw. The documents from Munich lay folded in her apron pocket, their weight both burden and shield. One soft April afternoon, a traveler knocked at the boarding-house door, an older woman in sensible wool, silver threading her hair, eyes sharp with recognition. Frau Becker, once a neighbor in the old Munich apartment building, come all this way with a small trunk of papers. "I read your notice on the church door," she said simply, accepting a cup of coffee in the warm kitchen. "Your father was a good man, cheated by partners who fled their debts. These are ledgers, sworn statements from those who knew the truth. The shame was never yours to carry." Ottilie traced the familiar signatures, tears pricking unexpected, proof at last that the whispers had been built on lies. She embraced the woman fiercely before seeing her off to the evening coach. Victor von Hohenlohe returned the very next day as though scenting weakness. He waited in the garden, legal papers crisp in his gloved hand, a bank draft for a sum that made Ottilie's breath catch, enough for a cottage in some quiet valley, a shop perhaps, a life unshadowed by want. "Sign, and it's yours," he said, voice smooth as oil. "No more mud slung, no more questions. Begin fresh. Elsewhere." The offer gleamed like temptation itself. She could leave the lingering glances, the half-healed wounds, start anew, as he said. That night, under a sky pricked with bright spring stars, Ottilie stood alone by the stove. The house slept around her. She fed the settlement papers to the flames one by one, watching the edges curl black, the generous figures vanish into ash. The life she had begun to love, the garden's green shoots, Annalise's laughter, Frida's steady wisdom, Emil's quiet presence, was not for sale. She closed the stove door on the last glowing ember, heart surer than it had ever been. But joy proved fragile. Word came at dawn. Emil's carriage had overturned on an icy patch high in the pass, horses spooked by melting snow. He lay unconscious at his lodge, ribs crushed, head bloodied. Ottilie ran through the muddy lanes, skirts hiked, breath ragged. She found him pale against white linens, beard stark against the pallor, breath shallow. The doctor had done what he could, now it was waiting and prayer. She took the chair beside his bed, clasping his warm, limp hand in both of hers. Hours blurred. She spoke softly of rosemary thriving, of lead crowns and shared plates, of storms faced together, and finally, voice trembling, the words she had carried unspoken. "I love you, Emil von Draben. Wake and hear it. Stay." His fingers twitched faintly in hers, or was it only hope? Will he wake to hear the words she's finally ready to say? Spring deepened into summer, and Emil mended by slow degrees. Fever came and went, ribs knit painfully. Ottilie rarely left his side, brewing willow bark tea, reading aloud from the few books on his shelves, her voice a steady thread pulling him back from the edge. On the day his hazel eyes opened clear and focused on her face, he whispered her name like a vow renewed. Word of her vigil spread quietly through Dravenfels. The village, touched by her nailed truth on the church door and the way she had faced down Victor's threats without bitterness, began to thaw in earnest. When Emil grew strong enough to speak of plans, expanding the old hunting lodge that had stood too empty since his loss, neighbors arrived unasked. Carpenters brought timber from their own stocks, women came with quilts and preserved fruits. Young men raised new beams under Emil's careful direction from a chair in the yard. Frida organized meals, Annalise darted about carrying nails and messages. Room by room, the lodge grew. A larger kitchen, sunny chambers under the eaves, a wide hearth big enough for gatherings, space for Frida and Annalise, space for wanderers who might arrive hungry on future New Year's Eves. Ottilie worked beside them all, hands callous now from honest labor, heart lighter with each hammer strike. Victor's shadow faded, his final papers unsigned, his threats hollow against the village's quiet solidarity. He did not return. Seasons turned again, snow returned to the peaks, then melted once more. On the next New Year's Eve, the bells of Drabenfels rang clear and joyous into the frosty night. Fireworks bloomed over the mountains, painting the snow in fleeting color. Ottilie stood on the widened porch of what was now truly home, hair loose for the first time, dark waves catching lantern light, eyes bright with hope hard won and freely given. Emile's arms circled her waist, steady and warm. Frida and Annalise laughed inside with neighbors gathered around the hearth. The air smelled of pine and spiced punch, of bread baking and futures unfolding. She was no longer running. She has learned that home is not a place you arrive at, but one you choose, nail by nail, truth by truth, heart by heart, to stay and build. Educational value. As Ottilie's story settles like fresh snow over Drabenfels, it leaves behind more than a tale of romance. It offers quiet lessons worth carrying into our own lives. First, it illuminates a slice of 19th century history, the mail-order bride arrangements born of hardship and necessity, where women traded uncertain futures for promised security across continents or mountain passes. Ottilie's telegram reminds us how fragile those promises could be and how resilience often bloomed in their ruin. The story also gently teaches Bavarian alpine traditions, Sylvester nights filled with spiced punch and church bells, the ancient custom of Bleigießen pouring molten lead into water to read the coming year's fortune. These small rituals show how communities have long marked time with hope and symbolism, shaping new beginnings rather than merely waiting for them. Beyond history and custom, deeper truths emerge. Ottilie learns that kindness without expectation is a rare gift worth accepting, not repaying with suspicion. She discovers that roots, whether rosemary in stony soil or chosen family, grow strongest through adversity. By nailing her truth to the church door, she proves that honesty can disarm gossip and reclaim one's narrative. Most enduringly, the tale whispers that home is not a destination arrived at by train or telegram, but a life forged deliberately, truth by truth, act by act, heartbeat by heartbeat. In a hurried world, these old-fashioned lessons of courage, community, and quiet second chances still light the way forward.